To kick us off, tell us a little bit about you. First of all, I see you were in the Army. Is that correct?
Yeah,
You're a veteran.
I am.
So I have a question for you, and then give us a little bit more intro. But did you have a nickname when you were in the military? And if so, what was it, and how did you get it?
Uh, yeah. I wish I could say it's this really, really badass thing that the guys gave me. When I was a platoon sergeant, when I was a platoon leader, my platoon sergeant had two daughters that were really young, and they loved me, but they knew another Patrick, and so they started calling me Fat Pat. So he was a larger man, and so that became the name. They started calling me Fat Pat. I got birthday cakes that said Fat Pat, and Fat Pat stuck around. So
I love it. I love it. Okay,
I wish
well,
wish it was something really badass, but
I mean, I think that's
Fat
kind of
Pat is what I
badass.
got.
I think that's kind of badass. You can own it.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, yeah, give us a little bit more about you, your story, what you're up to, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, I so after the army, I did the army right out of college, did ROTC in college. To run through the quick story and where I'm at now and how the failure will tie that in. But
Yeah,
I got out of the army back in 2018, moved out here to Charlotte, North Carolina, got into the corporate world, got into consulting, was in the finance banking space. Did that for a few years and started getting into real estate while I was doing that. Knew that I wanted to do something entrepreneurial, didn't know what, and real estate became the thing. So I bought a bunch of properties really quickly. About a year later, after I started, I ended up leaving USAA at the time, and dropped out of corporate America. And I was doing everything in real estate from long-term rental, short-term rental, single family, small multi, larger multi, did some flips and a few wholesales and stuff like that too. So I did a whole bunch of stuff in there along the way. And that's where there were a couple of the failures that we'll talk about that jump
yeah,
in. But part of it was I was at a GoBundance event a while 2.5 years ago and had someone just I was not in a great spot. I'd done a lot of flips very successfully, but then I started building a house flipping business, and it was just because it was the next thing for me. I had no desire to do it really, but it just seemed like the right thing to do. And so I started building it. I hated it. It wasn't working well. Once I flipped a lot of houses successfully until I built a flipping business, and then I didn't flip houses because I was so focused on all the other shit and hated what I was doing. And so I went through a lot of experimentation after that and pivoted away from real estate and got into the coaching space because for me, what I ended up finding through all of it was, first of all, I didn't really care about real estate. I cared about the result that it provided for me. And then the second thing was I realized that everywhere that I'd been in my career, I was focused on pursuing success by the definition of others, not myself. So in real
mm,
estate, for me, success was more deals. Success was
yeah.
building the business. Success was making it passive. It was all these other things. And I never actually backed up to say, like, what do I actually want out of my life? Or I had, but I hadn't actually started moving towards it. And so now the work that I do in the coaching space and in the community building space is I work a little bit one-on-one with business owners, but I'm heavily focused on building an online community and coaching community for people to basically help shift their perspective of success, help them create a more authentic version for themselves and help them achieve that without a lot of the limitations and all the bullshit and stories that we tell ourselves.
I love it, man. So share a specific moment in your life. I think you sort of alluded to it in your intro when you experienced significant failure. What was the goal you were trying to achieve? What went wrong? Take us down that path. Take us back in time.
Yeah, the culmination of all of it was a very distinct morning, January 3rd of 2023. Is that what it was? Yeah, that's what it was. And that was kind of the tail end of it and the aftermath. But I had up to that point, been the goal had been superficial in a lot of ways. The goal had been what it is for so many people, which was just freedom, financial freedom, time freedom,
Yeah.
all of these things that I never defined what they meant. And so I didn't really have a strong goal. my goal was this idea of a vision for my family and being able to provide experiences and all this kind of stuff to a small extent. But I didn't really have any other specific goals around that. And so I was just chasing a bigger business. Um, and so two different ways that I did that, and the two horrible failures that came together at the same time, which made it all even more painful, was if I rewind about a year and a half before that, I had just quit my job. I quit through a combination of rentals and flips. So I had probably a couple $1,000s a month coming in from my rentals, and then I was doing flips to supplement the rest of my income. And so I was looking for my whole plan and my whole goal with all of it was flip properties so that I could take the cash from that and put that into rentals. I built a portfolio of 20-ish, 21 doors, pretty much all through partnerships where I had brought very little money to the table and I'd done all the work. And it was great. But also because I owned so little, I owned anywhere between 40 to 60% of the deals. And so I was doing a ridiculous amount of work, but wasn't receiving a ton of profit from it. And so, or a ton of cash flow from it. And so I wanted to flip the script and I wanted to start owning my own deals. And so to shorten the story, as I was trying to build more cash flow, I first bought this eightplex. And this eightplex was a total shit show. It was $92,000. I think it was 97,000 on MLS, and I got up for 92. And it was the scope of the project was something that I had never come close to touching before. And I made every possible mistake and ignored every warning sign in order to make it happen, because I saw a bunch of opportunity with short-term rental. It was when that was getting really hot. I saw some opportunities to turn that into a short-term rental in a number of different units. And I saw the cash flow blow up. I saw all these projections blow up without the reality of the situation. I was naive in how I approached general contractors. And that deal, 6 months later, everything had gone to shit. The contractor that I was working with, who had been a friend of mine, he wasn't capable of doing it, for one. It was my fault for choosing him and knowing his lack of experience in the space. But he ended up taking it to such a negative point and then getting stuck and then walking off the job. And I think to this day, he still owes me $40,000+. But it got the property to a point where it was right before the inspections. And so all the rough-in work had been done, but none of it had been approved. And so no one is going to come in behind another contractor and accept their work. They're going to have to redo a bunch of it. And so I ran into all this. So at the end of the day, I tried to sell it. I ended up spending over a year trying to sell this thing. And it didn't, I was under contract 7 different times. I ended up finally in February of last year, a month after I had that kind of breaking point, I ended up selling it and I lost $200,000. And that was, thankfully it wasn't $200,000 at closing, but I lost $200,000 over the course of that year and a half that I just kept bleeding out. And then at the same time as I was dealing with that, the year prior in 2022, early 2022 is when I really started building the flipping business. And so I started building the marketing. I started to bring all of it in-house. And so I built all this marketing, but marketing isn't my thing. And it's not an area that I'm strong at. And everything else I'd done, I just use wholesalers. And so I started building this entire business with a whole bunch of overhead. I spent thousands of dollars a month building a team, not actually doing deals, and all of that fell apart as well. And I finally, 6 months in, I shut it all down. But I don't even know exactly how much money I spent on that. But between the two, I probably lost anywhere between $250,000 to $300,000. And it was all at the same time. And the mental, like, that doesn't account for the mental stress and all of the other shit that went alongside of that. So.
And so you mentioned at the very specific date of January 3rd, the morning of January 3rd, 2023. What was it specifically that happened in the morning of January 3rd, 2023?
I didn't sleep the night before. I barely slept. And that spent a lot of time sleeping in the field and in shitty environments in the Army. And so I usually don't have a problem sleeping at all. And I just, between the anxiety of the finances and not being able to sell that shitty property, I had another deal there was one deal that I bought while I had the flipping business. And the only reason I bought it is because I wanted to get a win for my team. And so I bought a deal that I otherwise wouldn't have bought, and it was a horrible deal. And I ended up running into a similar problem where I had to try to put a little bit of money into it to try to sell it to get it up to the point where it could sell, or eat a loss on it. And it fell out of contract 2 or 3 times as well. And these two deals were going on at the same time, and I was trying to sell them both and couldn't sell them both at the same time. And it just felt so helpless. And I was sitting there that morning talking to my wife and telling her that I couldn't sleep, telling her what was going on, and just had a bit of a breakdown. And
Mhm.
from that moment on, I'd started getting into coaching at that point. I had one person that had reached out, and I started to realize how much I enjoyed it. And so I'd started to experience the pivot, um, and the possibility on the other side. Oh, and the other thing, I forgot about this. The other thing that was going on at that time was I bought a lawn care company, but it was the slow season for lawn care. So we were losing money every month at that one too. So I just
Yeah.
had money pouring out everywhere, and I had
Goodness.
no idea how it was going to stop. I had no idea what was going to go on.
Yeah.
And that moment was the breaking point, and it also was the pivot point towards building what I have now. So
Yeah. No, man, um, it's incredible. It's how those moments are burned into our memories, right? They're seared into our minds. Um, so talk about from that day forward, right? What was clearly you were feeling like a failure, is what I'm hearing you say. A lot of self doubt, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. Um, I mean, that day, like, how did you cope with that? Like, what was that day like, and maybe the day beyond? How did you cope with that? How did you move forward? What was the step you took after coping with that? Maybe help break that down a little bit.
yeah, a lot of the coaching work that I do is now in the mindset space. And
Yeah.
I've generally been throughout my life, I've been a very positive person. And so when I was having the conversation with my wife, there was a big realization and conversation about I don't see that person right now. I don't
Mm,
see where I see a lot of the pessimism. I see a lot of the defeatism. I see a lot of the things that are just not me. And so having her call those things out was really incredibly powerful, because I think there's so many people that have I find a spectrum. There's people that have spouses and partners that are unsupportive and pull them backwards. There's other ones that'll be the cheerleaders that'll say, "Hey, you got it," and they'll go rah rah and they'll support. They're not going to get in the way, but they're not going to push forward. And my wife is one that will absolutely push me forward all the time. She challenges me to be better all the time, and she actively makes me, my business, my life better. And so when she challenges me in those moments, she calls out some of the painful things, and she did that. But it was that reminder of like, I see these things in my head. I haven't really been talking about a lot of them. Um, you see how I'm showing up, and that's not who I want to show up as. And so we, even that day, we had a little bit of a mantra, and it just became, because we're trying to get these two desperately trying to get these two awful deals sold. And I think one of them was under contract at the time, but even that, like because I'd been under contract on the other one 7 times, between the two of them, probably 10 times. I just had a ton of doubt and was being very negative about it. And so the mantra just became, it's going to sell. And everything was about the positive mindset and the framework of it's going to sell, it's going to sell. And then focus on the things that I can control and focus on the things that I care about. And so that was when I started being more proactive with leaning into coaching. That was when I started talking about it. And very quickly after announcing it, landed a number of clients, and that started to take off. And so it was really the immediate aftermath was finally holding up the mirror, and or having my wife hold up the mirror and say like, hey, this is not you. And that shift, that awakening and that awareness, I I have a hard time thinking about what that would have looked like if I was not a more naturally positive and optimistically inclined person. But
hmm
that created a really big snap that, like,
Yeah.
once I acknowledged the breaking point, I was able to start improving. I had just never fully acknowledged the breaking point because I didn't really want to admit it at that point.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point you make, right? Is that it seems like there was a path one way or the other, right? You could continue into despair, or you could go a different direction. what I hear you saying is, one, you had somebody in your life who was able to, as you said, hold up a mirror, which I think is a great way to say it. And there's a recognition of like, hey, this is not where I want to be, and I have a choice, right? And many times we need somebody to help us look at our reflection, to ask those hard questions. Um, and I think that's amazing. Doesn't make it any easier. Uh, but what did you feel in that moment? Like, tell me, maybe a few days later, or when that recognition, when you maybe made the choice to go a different direction, what was the, from anxiety and loss of sleep to what? What was the feeling like?
Relief was a big one. It felt, even just in that moment at that day, like I will never forget. I was sitting right over here. We have my office is downstairs. The stairs are right on the other side of my wall, and our bedroom and everything is upstairs. And I don't know why we sat uncomfortably for 2 hours, but I was at the bottom of the stairs, leaning up against the
Mm,
wall. She was like 3 stairs down from the top, and that's where we sat for 2 hours talking through all this stuff. And initially there was the frustration and the embarrassment, because a big part of it for me was she works a really successful job, and I always love to joke about her being when people ask what I do, I always talk about being a trophy husband. Um, but
nice.
she's incredible at what she does. And so we keep laughing now because the goal has always been that she works for a private company that is going to go public and sell in the next couple of years. And so the goal has always been, when that company sells, that she doesn't have to keep working if she doesn't want to, or she can have a lot more flexibility. And so I had put all of this pressure on myself to perform and provide in a certain way. And it was unnecessary, because she also enjoyed what she was doing, and she's a very career driven person too.
Mm-hmm.
So I had that embarrassment inside of me of feeling like a failure. I'd always talked about the dream. I'd always talked about the vision. And so feeling like, that self-doubt that crept in of, what if my wife starts to see me as full of shit and sees me as just a talker and not a doer? And
Mm,
so all of those fears kind of swirled around. And when we had the conversation, that broke. I didn't, like, the beginning of it, I did still feel some of the embarrassment, but once we started talking through it, it started to melt away. And then once we started tapping into that more positive mantra of the fact that it's going to sell and that things are going to be okay, I started adopting that a lot more. And so really, from that point on, I never really felt the same level of despair again. From that day and that conversation on, it was mostly looking up for, what can I do now? What can I do next? How can I keep moving the ball forward? And
mm-hmm.
celebrating all of the little things. I The worst deal of my life, $200,000 that I lost, and not to count the sleepless nights and everything else. But you can't see it here; it's right above me. I I bought a Lego set every time I would. I love Legos. I'm a little kid, and so Legos were my thing. Every time I would sell a deal or have a win or something like that, I would buy a Lego set. And there's a giant R2D2, and I thought that would be fun. But that was, even though I lost money on the deal, that became it was such a celebration the day that that deal closed, that when I talk about it, people are like, how the hell are you celebrating the day that you sell a $200,000 loss? And like, there was nothing better for my mental health and for my life than the day that
Yeah.
that thing was gone. And it was in February of that year. And so everything just became the positivity. Everything became the focus on the good, and the focus on the controllables, and the focus on the things that I care about and the things that are meaningful. And that's when I really dove fully into coaching, into transformation, into helping other people not feel the same way or not deal with the same type of issues or challenges or anything like that. Or at least know how to overcome them. So it created a new purpose behind what I was doing.
Yeah, clearly there's this theme of sort of turning setbacks into success, like that pivot, that turning point. You've thought about this a lot, and I think it's a great story to share. Um, what um, what was maybe something unexpected that happened during, in reflection? Like, hey, I didn't, going through this failure or this experience of failure, I didn't expect this to happen on the other side of it. Something surprising.
After, like, post that time frame?
Correct. Yeah.
Um, I guess one thing is that it made other challenges seem less important and less scary. I'd always, I've always had a strength, I mean, not always, but ever since my early time in the army, I've always had a strength of perspective and being mindful of how things could be worse or how good I have it or anything like that. But this gave, from a business standpoint, that was pretty bad. That was pretty fucking bad. Um, sorry, I don't know if I can use that language.
It's
Uh,
fine.
that one. So I think that was a big one. Another, as I think about it more, another another side of it was I'd always felt a little bit of like, you hear on social media or you hear on, I listened to a lot of bigger podcasts when I was in real estate, and you hear about the people that need, like, that had their big failure or had their first, or they hadn't at any point failed. And I feel like the failure that I experienced gave, like, it took a weight off in a lot of ways. I no longer felt like, um, I don't know. It's like baseball when you're throwing a perfect game. Like, as soon as the perfect game is broken, then you're no longer on edge trying to think about that one specific stat that you're trying to uphold. Like, the failure happened. I hope that I don't ever eclipse that failure, but failure happens. It's okay. I can learn from it. As long as I learn from it and I do something differently, it's okay. So those are probably the things that stick out the most.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you saying, your relationship with failure has changed in a sense, right? Like, it's not as scary as it maybe once was because you've been through, as you said, the shit, right? It's something that isn't as you said, that the other challenges is not, or challenges are less important, right? Or they're less scary or less anxiety ridden. Um,
Can I add one more thing to that?
Absolutely, please do.
There's one thing that just crossed my mind. The During that conversation and in that moment, one thing that I realized about myself and thinking about other entrepreneurs that I don't know that we take as seriously is, if you look at, like, my wife works for this food company that when they start, like, they have millions of dollars of debt and investors that they put into starting up. And I was so terrified of failure and of losing. And at that moment, one thing that I thought of is I had this business line of credit from one of my real estate companies, and I didn't touch it because it was debt and I didn't want to touch debt. The only time I ever used it was if I was doing a deal with it. Um, but then I started thinking about the flip side of, like, if other companies are willing to put their money where their mouth is and they're willing to take on investors and they're willing to take out a business loan because they're placing a bet on themselves ultimately and on the fact that they're going to succeed. My runway isn't dwindling because my cash is low. My runway is dwindling because I refuse to tap into something else and I refuse to look at this debt option. And I, as I've grown since then, like, ever since that point, I'm certainly not here to say that I think people should take out random lines of credit and use debt willy-nilly. I think that's a
Yeah, right.
horribly dangerous thing to do. But I also think if you're really serious about what you're doing, and like, especially once I got into the coaching space, like, I had that feeling of knowing, and I knew that it may take a matter of time before it gets going the way that I want it to, but it was going to be successful because there would be no other option for me than to make it happen. And if you're willing to make that kind of bet on yourself, then put your money where your mouth is, and you can tap into some of these other opportunities. And so that mindset shift for me then was, instead of having the fear of I've got a couple months of runway left, what happens when my runway is gone? I started thinking about, well, what if I just treated this as a startup loan for a business? And I started factoring that into my plan. Like, that gives me another 12 months of runway, which takes an enormous amount of fear off of my plate and enormous amount of stress off my plate. So it changed the way that I think. It changes the way that I now communicate with other entrepreneurs and business owners that are in similar situations. And it opens
Yeah.
up more possibilities and more options, but they're often limited by our own belief in ourselves.
I want to build on that for a second and maybe go a bit deeper. Can you share any subsequent success that you would attribute maybe in part or fully to this, to what you learned from this failure?
Yeah. Two things come to mind. One is there have been, since I quit my job, the year after I quit, I made more than I did at my job through flips, but it was all through buying and selling deals. It was all, individual hits a couple
Yeah.
times a year. Until the end of last year, I had never had a consistent like monthly income that exceeded not even exceeded where I was before, but exceeded my bills. I'd always been in catch up mode. I'd always been in runway mode. And so this shift in mindset and this shift in business strategy and approach led to that happening, which was a huge win. And then also it's gone back and forth. Like part of the coaching business is clients go and then the contract ends, and some renew and some don't. And then if I'm not still, marketing is not my strongest suit. And so when I'm all in on the client side, then I forget to push the marketing and to bring more people in. And so there's those ebbs and flows, but it meant for me that the ebbs and flows weren't that big of a deal anymore. I obviously don't want them. I want the consistent steady rise, but if there is a little bit of a downturn, it's at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal, especially compared to before.
Yeah. Right. I love that. Well, I think, this is something that I'm really excited to ask you, because I feel like you're going to have a lot of thoughts here, but, advice for others, right? So, what, just sort of open-ended question, what would you tell someone who's going through something very similar to you, who is in the middle of it, and maybe you're that person with the mirror, or maybe, somebody in their life, but what would you tell them?
There's no good that comes from chasing a number or chasing a certain either break even point or not losing money or anything like that. There were a number of times that, looking back, if I hadn't been so concerned with the money, and I think this is probably the bigger lesson in all of it, but mental space and energy and mental clarity and peace, all of those things that sound wooey and sound weird compared to cold hard cash. Like at the end of the day, when I sold that deal for a $200,000 loss, I was under contract 3 months before to break even on it. And I signed the paperwork, the buyer never showed up, and the deal never went through. And then finally I got to the point where, and there were multiple times before that where I had the opportunity to drop the price a little bit more. And I was stubborn, and I thought, no, fuck this guy. I'm not budging on this. You're being a dick. I'm just going to stick at this. And it cost me. Not only did it cost me money, which ultimately dropped the price significantly, but it also cost me my mental health. It cost me my sanity in a lot of ways. It made everything worse. So if you can focus on, if you're in that type of situation, it's hard to say don't focus on the money, but focus on focus on who you are, and focus on your own peace and stability internally more so than the money, because you can always earn more money, but the damage that comes from operating in a place where you're like, I'm not an angry person, and I found myself getting very angry, especially if I ever spoke to or was around anything related to that contractor. Just because I couldn't comprehend how he was doing business and how horrible it was. And it just, every time I was around it, it was so toxic, and it made me so angry that I didn't recognize myself. And all of that went away once I sold the deal, once it was no longer an active problem. And so get rid of the pain point and do your best to move on as quickly as possible, as opposed to trying to hold on and hold out for another dollar or another win or another whatever you want to call it. I think that is overall the biggest thing. And then the second one that I'd say is dig into and remind yourself of the overall why. And it sounds a little bit trite sometimes, but at the end of the day, when you push, like, the reason people get burnt out is either because they don't have a why, or because they're so caught up in the weeds and in the nitty gritty that they lose sight of the why. And I very much lost sight of that as I was chasing and holding on to it and doing all of these things. And when you zoom out and you refocus on that, then the goal shifts from how do I make this deal happen or close out or whatever in the best business sense. And instead, how do I move on as fast as possible so that I can keep moving on my mission that I have and on the purpose
Right.
that I'm trying to fulfill? So I think those are probably the two things that I'd share.
Man, I love that. There's so many just nuggets of wisdom and tools and practices here. Final question, and we'll close this out. But in hindsight, is there anything about your failure experience, your failure story that makes you laugh now? That's funny.
Uh, there's the absurdity of it all is definitely one thing. There's in the middle of that deal, my daughter was born. And so we
Mm,
have a picture of the middle of July when she was a month old, strapped to my wife. It was when right before the deal totally went sideways and the contractor said that he wasn't going to be a part of it anymore. And we're walking through trying to do an inventory and trying to plan things out. And we're getting eaten by bugs out there. My wife is like swaddled with our newborn on top of her. We're both just sweating our asses off and totally miserable. And like looking, it wasn't funny at the moment whatsoever. None of this shit was funny at the
right,
moment. But
right.
looking
In
back, we're
hindsight,
like,
yeah,
what were we doing? Why? That was so bad. Um, so that was one. There's probably others.
yeah.
I'll let you know. But
Okay,
that's the first one that jumps out. That picture is every time my wife
yeah,
sees that picture, her response is less laughter than mine.
yeah. I understand. She sounds like a great partner for you.
Yes.
Um, well, tell people how they can get a hold of you, how they can contact you. You have a coaching business. I'd love for people to be able to connect with you if they choose to do so.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Best things are one, Instagram. It's the Patrick Menefee, Menefee. Also, if you know the person that has just my name and not the Patrick Menefee, let me know because I want it. Um, Separately,
Okay.
you can go to for any of the coaching work or the community work, joinbecomingkinetic.com is the best website to go to. And yeah, just shoot me a DM on Instagram. Otherwise, that's probably the best way to do it. Email probably get buried. So
Yeah. Awesome, Patrick. Well, I really appreciate it. I think this was an incredible story. I think a lot of people can, empathize with this. Losing $200,000 is no joke. But there's a lot of really great things around mindset and mantra and things I think that we could take away and help us all work through those moments of failure. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
yeah, man, absolutely. Thanks for the conversation.